we were at a meeting last night, and there was somebody with a gavel, and he really hammered the. I was told I need to get off here.
Emphatic.
Too.
Yeah, I know.
I thought it was pretty.
Get deliberate.
So anyway, welcome everyone to the January 25th City Council work session, everyone here and at home. And before we get to the first item that you see on our agenda, Beth wanted a few moments to talk to you about the Toxic Board.
Thank you. We just hoping to get some direction about scheduling interviews. We're looking at Monday evening for interviews. As you see on your ballot, had only gotten enough votes to interview one person, and then today we received more information from the Toxics Board with their recommendation, which is for the other person who hadn't gotten enough votes yet. So just wanted to know if we should proceed with interviews on Monday, and if we should interview just the one person who has enough votes, or both people, or what's your...
Why don't we just
do both.
Why don't we just go right around and see what people say, and that's the most do it as efficiently as quickly as we can. So, Chris, you look like you were ready to have an opinion. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm fine with both. I think it's
Interview
fine.
both.
I would interview both. I think we should listen to what the board's recommendation is, and it would be good to talk about. I won't be able to be there, but I do think you should talk to both. See how easy that is for me?
But I hope you all have a good time.
I hope you guys have a good time.
Alan.
I think interviewing both, and Monday works for me. Where are we talking, 5:30?
5:30.
Yeah, that works for me.
Daddy?
I can be there, but I didn't think we should interview the one that just got 2 votes.
Okay. George?
Well, I think we should go ahead and interview both, but I just find it a little upsetting that we've got some counselors that weren't able to get their ballots back in for either interview or appointment. I mean, we're asking the citizens to get more involved in these boards and commissions, yet we can't take it upon ourselves to turn in a simple ballot. So I'm okay with interviewing both of them.
Mike?
I'll be good with interviewing both as well.
George?
Let's talk to both of them. Did you say how many ballots were turned in?
We had 5.
5 turned in? Okay. I'm both fine. Monday's fine.
And Andrea?
Yes.
So it sounds to me like it's a go for 2. All right. Thank you.
Send out a revised tentative agenda showing that on the schedule for Monday.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So the first work session item is on the downtown public safety zone. City manager?
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll ask the chief to come on up and lead us through that discussion, and whoever else on his team he chooses.
Hard to complain about the public process if you don't vote.
Counselor?
Right.
If I scoot in. Well, good afternoon, and we have a presentation on the status of the downtown public safety zone and how it's been working. And Lieutenant Sam Campcar, who's in charge of the downtown area for the police department, will be making a presentation. And Dan Barkovic from our city prosecutor.
All right. Thank you.
I heard him.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, thank you. Let's see if I can work this thing properly. Alrighty then. Well, my name is Sam Camcar, and I recently had the privilege of taking over the downtown operation. We're going to take just a couple of minutes to give you a brief overview of where we've been in the last 3 years and do a very basic statistical analysis of our successes.
Sam, would you mind speaking up a little,
Some
please?
of the milestones, is that better?
Mike doesn't actually make you any louder. If you just have to do it yourself.
We'd love to hear you, man.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alrighty then. So, as you can recall, back in August of 2008 is when the order was signed by the council. The program was implemented in October of 2008, and in 2010 we implemented the 12-point downtown safety program. We began to bring in additional officers to the team, and December of 2010 is when the additional order was adopted. And we're scheduled the program is scheduled to sunset in April of 2012. and that's why we're here today. Hopefully persuade you otherwise. We'll try to extend that. Just as a reminder, the boundaries, does this have a laser pointer by any chance? There we go. The Lane County Courthouse is not included in the DPSZ boundaries. It goes from 7th all the way up to 11th, and from Pearl to Lincoln, including this small section off of Lawrence. Starting from the left, over the past 3 years, we've had 133 exclusions that were granted. 27 were one-year extensions through the municipal court, and 90 days, 26 of them were dismissed, and 15 denied. And I'll talk about that, what those numbers mean, in just a few seconds. If you look at the numbers, at the very in the center of the graph right there, where it talks about the 90 days dismissed, that represents about 12% of the overall exclusions, which is basically 26 of them. And those dismissals are basically through the municipal court judges, where they may have disagreed with the officer's opinion or judgment at the time. The ones that are denials, which represent 7%, which is equivalent to 15, those are primarily paperwork issues, where an officer might have issued an exclusion notice, and by the time it worked its way from the officer through the records and to the courtroom, it just didn't make it in time, or something similar to that nature. Looking at the comparisons of arrests, for the last 3 years, over 5,600 offenses, citations and arrests. Out of those, only 185 exclusions have been issued, which equates to roughly about 3.3% of the overall picture. With reference to demographics, we saw a decrease in juveniles. As a reminder, the exclusion zone does not apply to juveniles, but what we did see in the last few years was that fewer juveniles were, we were coming in contact with fewer juveniles over the last 3 years, by 11%. Personally, I was excited to see that. The young adults, it's referring to people between the ages of 18 and 24, and the adults are people the age of 24 and up. When I was looking at, if I may say so, when I was looking at what's happened in the last 3 years, having not been involved in the downtown operation, a couple of things that stood out for me personally. One was, especially looking at the numbers of the number of people who've been excluded, was that it was clear to me that the officers have been judicious and responsible in the way they've been administrating this new tool. The second thing that came out for me personally was the fact that we have fewer juveniles that we're coming in contact with by 11%, and that was noteworthy. What we're hoping to be able to do today is to ask the council to consider a change in the Eugene Section Code 4.875 to reflect the legislative intent, which is where it is currently written as shall, the officer shall take enforcement action or issue a notice, and to change that to may. And secondly is to either extend or eliminate the sunset provision. And the reason behind that is because, as you can imagine, going through this process every few months is extremely taxing, it's time-consuming, and I think over the last 3 years we've had enough data, enough time to be able to see that that the officers have done a good job of being judicious and responsible in handling this new program. So with that in mind, I'll leave questions.
Thank you very much. You want lights back on?
Yes, lights, please.
Okay, Mike, you're first.
Thank you, Mayor. As I see that we don't have a formal manager-recommended motion on this, and I just heard Lieutenant Gamcar suggest one, I'm going to start with a motion, I'll speak to it if I get a second, that we move to have the manager bring back to us the ordinance appropriately changed to reflect the shall changed to may, and to eliminate the sunset.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded.
This is something that Councilor Ortiz and I worked on in the summer of 2008 and brought forward initially because of some of the things that were happening downtown and because of the lack of support that was capable of being provided by Arlene County Jail. And this was a tool we could give our officers that would make things safer downtown for people. It's clearly succeeded. It's been reported by our municipal court, by the officers involved, by everyone that has any contact with it. It's been listed as a success. The auditor's office has received exactly 0 complaints in 3 years about this in any way. And just recently, the Police Commission held extensive public hearings on this ordinance and asked people's opinions and to come and talk with the Police Commission, and then they voted at their last meeting to endorse and recommend to council that we extend this and remove the sunset. So I hope that that my colleagues will pass the motion on the table and that we'll bring it back at council and pass it. Thank you.
I have Betty, and then George Poling, and then George Brown. Betty?
Thank you. I guess we need to talk about the motion now, but I suppose it's all the same topic. I don't think we have any figures on what difference the increased police presence. What I'd like to see us do, we say we tried this out. I voted against it, of course, and I will again. But I'd like to see us try at least a year without this and see and compare that with now that we have more police presence. I think that would be a good trial to compare. Also, I think I found Claire Surratt's letter very persuasive and thorough and convincing. I said persuasive already. It's very convincing, even if I had been for this in the beginning. I think it's a matter of civil liberties. Another thing I would like a trial of not having it with the police protection. I would also like to know if there are any records of where those excluded people went after they were excluded. Were they arrested some other place? Did they come back downtown after the exclusion ended? And I think we should compare that before we take any votes. And I think the part of the thing that was very persuasive is that the kinds of people who will be excluded probably are not the ones that have enough faith in the system to complain, or maybe sometimes enough knowledge to know how to do it, even though you give them a brochure. So I think it's a violation of civil liberties. Northrop's letter was very good too, and there's another one I can't think of the name of the person right now, which was shorter, which gives some good reasons for not doing this. Thank you.
George Poling?
Thank you. In reading some of the material, there were some comments from the public that, I think it was at the Police Commission meeting, that the information of being made readily available to the people that were issued these by the officers and before they went to court. Has that been remedied where it's easy for them to get that, or is it going to be given to them at the time of the citation, or how is that going to be addressed?
Just for clarification, are you referring to the advocacy program?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yes, the officers, as a matter of practice, they hand out the brochure every time they hand out an exclusion order. And we've taken a look at the brochure, and we have some ideas about how to make it better.
Okay.
Perhaps using brighter colors or a different language, simplifying it a little bit so that it gets the attention of folks.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, I'm impressed with the outcome so far of the exclusion zone process that we have in place, and, I just think it's working. And, I'm willing to support the motion. I do have a question as to some of the theories on why you want it changed from shall to may on the citations, and where'd that concept come from? Did it come from the officers themselves or the management of your department, or where'd that come from?
Both. And if I can defer that to Dan?
Yeah, I think that, well, for one thing, I think there's been an administrative order put into place that allows the officers to use discretion presently. And this language would allow that to be part of the ordinance, not just an administrative order. And because not everyone who commits any one of these offenses should be excluded from downtown, quite frankly. My experience in handling dozens and dozens and dozens of these cases is that the officers have been able to focus on either offenders or offenses such as drug transactions that are really at the core of what the downtown community wants to have looked at quickly and expeditiously. So the change in the ordinance would allow the officers to use that discretion, not requiring them to issue an exclusion order to anybody who commits any of these offenses. I think that's the background of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Pat?
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a quick question. Certain that we've seen it at some point, but other municipalities have similar ordinances. Do we have a listing of has similar ordinances in certain zones in the city?
We can get that for you for the next session.
Thank you. If you would include that as part of Councilor Clark's request. Thank you. If Councilor Clark would agree. Thank you.
Chris?
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate the report. Two things. One, I wanted to address explicitly, and that is if you were to look at this information, particularly Table 1 on page 4 of the report, it would show, at least superficially, that after the implementation of the exclusion zone, crime has gone up. And so I think what you need to be explicit about is we're talking about offenses here, not necessarily the amount of criminal activity. So if you could speak to why the numbers would be larger as opposed to has crime increased or has the reporting or offenses increased. I think that's important for people to distinguish between.
You bet. Our theory is that we basically have more officers on the street, more eyes, and they're seeing these violations and they're taking enforcement action. And as a result of that, crime is going up. Now, it's not necessarily reported crime. In some cases it is because of the fact that the officers are available. A lot of the business owners or the stakeholders have the cell phone of the officers, so they call them. They're more inclined to know that there's going to be a service or a prompt response on the part of the officers, so they'll take that time to make contact and report that incident. But aside from those reported crimes, there's the personal observations on the part of the officers as well too. So more officers on the street equates to more numbers.
So what I'm understanding is that it doesn't necessarily mean that crime has gone up since the implementation of the exclusion zone. The reporting, the observation, the ability to cite, the ability to manage has become more intensive. In other words, there may have been a lot of criminal activity that never got reported, never got cited, was never noticed. That's the inference. I mean, we don't know for sure what was going on because it was never reported. But we can't infer that as a result of the exclusion zone, somehow crime has gone up. Simply the reporting and the citation has gone up, but not necessarily the crime. We would hope that over time, the actual numbers of citations would then begin to go back down as the exclusion zone begins to take effect compared to where it was before. In other words, if you looked at the time the exclusion zone was implemented over a period of time from its beginning, you would begin to see crime go down. That would be a mark of whether or not the exclusion zone is working. That would be the intent.
That's correct. We would agree with you.
The second question, which I have always asked and I will ask again because it's an extremely important one, and it has to do with the use of the exclusion zone. And that is a question I asked Judge Allen. In his mind, or in your mind, is the exclusion zone being used as a method to get certain types of people out of downtown? Is it being used as a way to cite behavior, or is it a way to get rid of certain people we don't like?
Our officers have constantly and consistently concentrated on behavior, criminal behavior. And certainly at times those criminal behaviors are with certain folks, that repeat offenders that they come in contact with. But that's been the target audience is what is it that people are doing rather than specific people.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
George Brown?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think the motion that Mike made, I think it's unnecessary because we do have a public hearing scheduled on this matter, don't we, next month?
We do.
And usually what happens after a public hearing, then there's action scheduled. So, I mean, I just don't think it's necessary to do that right now. I mean, it seems like it's already in the pipeline. Yeah, I've looked at these statistics and the statistics that have been presented before, and I don't think that they show conclusively that it's been that been effective compared to what we already had in just the criminal system that we had before this thing was enacted. I don't see that there's this overwhelming evidence that it's been effective. And I think Betty's question was very good. What happens to the people that are excluded if they're, in frequent contact with the police? They're going to be in contact with them in Whitaker or Transong or Midtown or the University District. I mean, I don't know that it's been effective in reducing crime. In other words, it seems like to me it seems like an unnecessary layer, adding civil penalties on top of a system that we already have. For instance, yes, and I think the rise in contacts and crimes and arrests and citations is due to the presence of more officers downtown on a more regular basis, and I think that's great. I totally support that part of it. But what I've heard from the Midtown Businessmen Associations is that they've hired a private security company to handle complaints in the area along the Willamette on each side of the street up to 18th or a little past 18th. They've seen a huge spike in problems in that neighborhood. So not only have we seen an increase in crimes downtown, but there's also been other activity to the area immediately adjacent to downtown. So I just don't. I've got a couple questions anyway. It'll be a while before we vote on this. If you are going to, but if the motion passes to make it permanent, it may. I don't think I can support a permanent creation of this zone, but the changing of I'd be willing to support the changing of the wording from shall to may, because really when you think about it, every time a police officer comes in contact with somebody, they're exercising their good judgment and their experience and their discretion whether to cite that person or not. A lot of times, am I over? Okay, sorry.
Sorry. Just letting you know.
Thank you.
Alan?
Lieutenant, can you tell us the number of police officers that have been assigned to downtown, kind of the timing since the exclusion zone's gone into business? I think it started out with the 2 bicycle in 2008, and then we ratcheted that up, and now we have 6 officers, and that's going to increase in July to 9. So we've seen actually a tripling of the number of police officers downtown today since the inclusion zone started, and we're going to see another 50% increase.
That's correct.
And what about the red caps? Have they increased?
I don't know.
Does anybody know that? And yeah, it is, the statistics are interesting. I attribute the number of offenses increase to the number of officers. I mean, the more officers there are, the more, what you can't tell is if crime's gone up or down. You can't say that it's been a success and then crime gone down because you've got more offenses. So right now, you can't say definitively that this has had, what kind of impact this has had, except anecdotally. The one thing that I would point out is the public perception of downtown has improved, and that was pointed out in the report, that the number of people who are satisfied with downtown went up from 33 to 37%, and the number that are somewhat or very dissatisfied went from 64 down to 54. So actually the perception of downtown has has really improved, but I think it's really complex why that's true. It's not the exclusion zone that's doing that by itself. I mean, there's $85 million worth of development that's going down there. There's more people downtown. There's more eyes on the street. There's free parking, right, Mike?
There is. In fact, it's just another little bonus, isn't it?
I'm sure that contributes.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear you say that.
You missed the cynicism and sarcasm part. So I think it's hard to segregate.
The minutes have that, though, Al.
I'm sure they have the sarcasm part
All right.
underlined too.
Working your time there.
I think it's hard to segregate it out. I think so. To definitively say this has really worked is very difficult to do. I still have the same concerns I had before that I won't go into around due process. The one question, two questions I have are: there's one of the slides you had about 20%, 19% of the things brought before the judge were denied. So that's 1 in 5 were denied, or said differently, misapplied by a police officer that the judge overturned it. And so that's a little troubling to me. I'm wondering why that's so. And that's only of the ones that are actually challenged, correct? If they're not challenged, then, and that's the majority are not challenged.
It could be some that are dismissed on the morning of the hearing when it's determined that the offense that is sought to be used as the exclusion is really not a 90-day exclusion list item. It's a 1-year exclusion if convicted, but it's not eligible for a 90-day exclusion because it's not on that 90-day list. I think that could reflect that classification of cases, too.
Can we get that? Do you have that data?
I don't have it at my fingertips.
I know, but
no.
we have a while before we decide this.
Yeah,
but
we could probably access.
figure out what the makeup is of those 20%.
But I just want to make sure, I don't think it's a 20%. The dismissed is a 12%.
Well, they're denied and dismissed, right?
Okay, you're using both.
Yeah, I don't have both up.
Yeah, I think that denied and dismissed, and again,
What's the difference?
as Lieutenant Kamkar mentioned, where the paperwork doesn't get to the court, the person doesn't even have to request a hearing. It's simply dismissed at that point, because in order to make the decision, the judge has to have the appropriate police report and show cause order, and if they don't have that at the time of the first appearance, they just dismiss the show cause.
Okay. Only round 2, Mayor.
Okay. Andrea?
Thank you, Mayor. So, first of all, on page 7 of 16, on the demographics of ethnicity, you have white, Native American, African American, Asian, other unknown. And so I'm going to assume that the Latinos are in with the white. Is that correct? Would that be your interpretation of it?
In some cases, as you can imagine, some people may identify themselves as Latino or Hispanic, and so yes and no. And we can get further clarification for you on that one.
Okay, if you could, that would
Yes.
be nice. So I and Mike did work on this. It's true. It was challenging to me because of the fact that it is, that if it's city-owned property, if it's city-owned streets, everybody should have access to them. And I agreed to support it at the time because we really didn't have a whole lot of tools in our toolbox, as gets used a lot. But since 2008, as it's been said by the counselors, we're going to be increasing to 9 officers. We have the red caps and we have the Midtown security that are all downtown patrolling. Crime has leached into the neighborhoods. Monroe area, I know, has had some concerns. When Monroe Street Park becomes an issue, the Whitaker, the train song is a little far-reaching. But so I'm not really sure how this is going to continue. Because for me, this was a stopgap measure. This was a way to get to the point where we're going to have 9 officers downtown permanently. And I think that is going to be more effective than anything, personally. And the perception of downtown has improved greatly because of a lot of things that we've done. But other neighborhoods have had challenges of quality of life, and so, I'm just not sure. Mike, I'm not going to support your motion because I feel like it's going to be coming back to us anyway. And I think that in the time that after the hearing, there will be stuff that the city manager is going to recommend, a motion that the city manager is going to recommend. So I think to ask for him to do that prematurely would be, moving things faster than what the staff is available to do. That's all I have for now, Mayor.
So I have second round, Mike, George Polling, Pat, and Alan, and George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor.
I'm not going to, but I'm going to say something first. My feelings about this are that the intention is for us actually to have less and less need for a safety zone, and that we move toward the place where that isn't necessary. So that I do think that's our overarching goal. On the counterpoint from what Alan brought up about judges dismissing a certain amount of those, I think on the good side is it's showing that part of the function is working, that we actually do have another level to go to make sure people are getting more due process. So I think that's a good thing as opposed to a bad thing. I can see how you can see it from both ways, but I do think it's showing that function is working. I think it's a good question about whether we have the same need as we did a year ago. I do think that we still hear that this is a tool in the toolbox because we still have our jail bed problem. That still exists, and it hasn't gone away, and that hasn't changed, and we don't know when that's going to change. So that's something I think that we have to consider. I would say to all of you that ever since we've been dealing with law enforcement issues in this community, I have never seen a time when you didn't move it from one place that it didn't go to another place. So that's just a fact. Every time we've ever moved in to clean out one area, we have it pop up in another area. I've heard the chief say that over and over again. We hope we dissuade some people. We hope we remove some people, but we do move it around. That's just a fact. And so the perception thing's important. I guess the biggest thing for me is that we're careful. I would not want to get rid of the sunset. I'd want to examine it again in a year if you chose to keep it going. I'd wanted the opportunity to examine it again in a year to see if we're in a different place. And then the other thing about the perception is that we are in a very important moment right now where things are all moving in the right direction. So you have to really think about when's the right time to make a change and when is not the right time to make a change. We're trying to do two things. We're trying to have a safer downtown. At the same time, we're trying to have a more lively, invigorated, fun place for people to be. So we're trying to make both of those things happen. We're trying to respect people's liberties, and we're trying to have a safe community. So all of those things are on the table right now, and the proper balance and when's the right moment to shift things, that's the question before us. Mike, you're up.
Thank you. The mayor's right. On 2, 3 of those points, at least, if not more, that I think she nailed it exactly. And took several of the points I was going to make, that the timing is an important part. I would respond to my friend George and Andrea that I made the motion today because the staff made a recommendation for a change that I did or did not know whether that would come forward in the manager's recommendation, and because I wanted to fulfill the will of the police commission's recommendation and the public hearings and all the public work that they did in order to make a recommendation to us. And my request was not to forestall the public hearing that we have already put in front of us, but simply to have him make those changes with what he brings back to us for that. So, I mean, it's just to move the ball down the field a little farther is the only reason for my motion today. But I would say I have a fairly strong disagreement with my friend George about its effectiveness. And the thing I would ask you to do is to ask Tom Camus, has this made a difference? Because is he being confronted violently by people with violent harassment? And the answer is he's not. I'd ask you to speak with Betty Snowden and find out if she's still getting racist things written and said to her face and screamed at her and written on her building and her front windows broken and things being left out in front that were so far over the line, and the only tool the officers had was to arrest someone so they could spend an hour in the jail before they were matrixed, to come right back out and get in her face again. So I apologize, I don't mean to be so confrontational about this, but I think it has worked and done exactly what we wanted it to do, which was to take the very worst offenders out of the picture before there was conflict that we would regret. It set a separation of parties that had gone too far. And we did a good job of having put this in place so the officers could do the job of, just like a restraining order, separating parties that were too violent and too confrontational with one another. Now, the question of, well, maybe if we let this go, it'll be fine now because we have more officers. I would fundamentally disagree with that. It's a wonderful thing, a fantastic thing that we have more officers, and that certainly is helping. But we still have a dysfunctional jail. We have no jail with the capacity to hold offenders responsible. And I fear that even with the number of officers we have to make arrests, the folks that were the worst of the worst doing things and harassing and intimidating folks downtown knew that they weren't being held responsible. This tool gave them the chance to be held responsible. Thank you.
George Pauling?
Yeah, and I'll just kind of pick up on that and also agree with what the mayor said, that this ordinance was put in place, this zone was put in place as a tool, to hold violators accountable. The county's lost 84 jail beds since July. It's right there in your AIS, and I believe it's $13.5 million shortfall that the county's looking at for this upcoming fiscal year. Based on my 25 years of working with Lane County, I can guarantee you where they're going to start looking first. It's public safety. That's what they did the 25 years I was there. So how many more jail beds are we going to lose? I think this is a very important, one of the many important tools that we have available to us is to use this because we don't have the jail beds. And we're not exactly on solid financial ground either, and what happens if we lose any of those 9 officers that are currently assigned to the downtown area? This is something that we need to keep in place for a number of reasons. And the last thing I'd like to do is, Lieutenant Kamkar and Sergeant Fitzpatrick, I see you sitting back there, I just want to thank you and your troops for the way you have administered this and addressing the behavior and not the individual. I think that was a bigger concern throughout the entire community, is how this was going to be administered. And I believe that you folks have done it the right way, and you've shown it, and I think that this is just one more reason to continue this, the exclusion zone.
Pat?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a comment and a question. First, regarding the suspicion that crime has just moved around. I think in certain places, and I'd like a comment on this perhaps, it's easier to commit crime. Whether it's because there's a greater concentration of people who potentially could be committing crime, so you get hidden maybe a little bit better, or maybe there's they're doing it, so I'll do it. So when you kind of break up a concentration in a particular area, which downtown is a natural area for people to concentrate, then I'd like any statistics or any comment on, does that actually break up the intent or break up the possibility of crime? And
the studies that we've looked at that indicate how best to address concentrations of crime suggest that focused patrols like those that you've authorized with a larger downtown patrol team will disperse those concentrations of crime, and where they do occur elsewhere are in smaller concentrations. And the philosophy that we're using, not just here, but in our data-led policing, is to focus officers where there's crime so that as it disperses, we focus our officers there, and over time we reduce crime in Eugene. The loss of the jail beds undermines our efforts there somewhat.
Thank you. I'd be kind of curious to see if the sum of the dispersed crime is equal to the amount of the crime that was dispersed. I don't expect you to have statistics on that readily. My second is a comment regarding a word that was used, and it's, when we use words, they can be incisive, they can be aggravating, and they can cause people to take things personally when perhaps the word shouldn't have been spoken. The word that I'm looking at in this instance is the word misapply, regarding the 1-to-4 ratio of cases that have been dismissed, that are dismissed by the judge. The word that officers have misapplied the ordinance or misapplied the intent of the ordinance. I disagree with that. I don't think that the fact that cases are dismissed indicates at all that officers are necessarily misapplying the ordinance. I think that the explanation that we received, that some of the cases are dismissed because of the procedural issues. Some cases are dismissed because the paperwork is not carried out correctly. To characterize the fact that 1 in 5 cases is dismissed doesn't indicate that police officers are misapplying. And I trust the judgment of our police officers, and I don't believe that 1 out of 5 cases indicate misapplication in any way, shape, or form.
Alan?
Well, I guess we'll find out when we get the data about what that means and how many were paperwork problems and other issues. I do think it's been judiciously used, only 3.3%. So I do applaud that. The way that it's being done downtown, it alleviated a lot of fears that I and other people had at the beginning that it would be used more than it is. I have a couple of questions. One is about the one of the major violations or offenses in the downtown area is the liquor violations. It's like it's a 20% of it or so, a fifth. And I'm wondering what happened to that idea of getting rid of malt liquor and being able to ban that in the downtown area. And if you could follow up on that.
I can't.
It was in the legislature, but I don't remember what happened after that.
The legislation didn't pass, but our lobbyist believes that we might be able to find another way to go about that.
Yeah.
With new legislation in the February session, or
using the existing administrative rules.
Oh, and still be able to do that exclusion of malt liquor.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd be curious to have that be brought back because that's a big problem in many neighborhoods. I'm also curious to see the data be brought back about where the neighboring the neighboring neighborhoods and what happened in those crime areas. And I'm sure we've got statistics about that because it does get pushed around. I'm also interested in the advocacy program and how that's working. I saw the brochure, but also read in the testimony Neil Van Steenbergen, who's one of the advocates that was hired to do this, said it wasn't really an advocacy program. It's really a direction, showing people where to go program. And so, any comments about how that's working?
Okay. So far, the advocacy program hasn't been tapped into by any of the folks who've received the exclusion notices. We don't know why. Anecdotally, we have some theories. One of those is what I mentioned earlier, is that just looking at the way the brochures are set up, frankly, it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Most people look at this and trying to figure out what it really means. And we're examining that, and we think that we may be able to make it a little bit more user-friendly. The other part of that is that we've been in communication with the court about that, and another option would be to have the judges to remind the defendants at the time when they show up or the recipients to be able to, that there is an advocacy program available for them. So we've heard that the concerns loud and clear, and I think there's areas for improvement. We just have to get there.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to see some follow-up. That was one of the things I was interested in when we made the change last time around. On the change from shall to may, there's actually 3 shalls in that one section, 4.875. I suspect it's just the first one that is the one that we want to change. So, and the rationale behind that is?
Legislative intent, it's our interpretation, having monitored or watched the meetings where you made the decision, was that you intended for us to use our discretion in the application of this, not to issue an exclusion order in every single arrest that we make downtown.
Of these kind of offenses.
Exactly. So rather than 5,000 and some exclusions over the last 3 years, there's only been 185.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you've been doing that. I agree with the mayor that this shouldn't be permanent, and that this was intended to be a stopgap till we got the 9 officers in place, which will happen in July. So we'll have gone from 2 officers when this started to 9 officers. That's a big jump in downtown. Hopefully that we won't need all those 9 officers in downtown. They'll be able to go out into the surrounding neighborhoods as well, over by the university, over Midtown, some places different, to deal with the pushing out of the crime. And then we also have the jail bed problem, and I don't see that being fixed anytime soon. But we also have downtown development, which has been going on, and more eyes on the street and things like that. So I won't support the motion because I think it's actually premature at this point.
So we're at the 1:45. It's time for us to move to the next item on our agenda. I have 3 of you in the queue. I'm just going to encourage you to be as quick as you can. And Mike, while we're doing that, maybe you'll think about whether we actually need a motion or not today.
I still think we do, and
Okay.
I just have my third round is real quick. Am I
Okay.
first on that, or?
No,
You're still in
you're
the second
not.
round, because I'm on the second round. I haven't had my second round.
Oh, I didn't know that you were in the second round. I'm sorry, Chris.
Or did you?
Okay.
But go ahead.
I was just going to ask an operational question, which is actually germane. The difference between passing this motion today and not passing this motion today in terms of what happens next, could you describe, if it passes, what happens, if it doesn't pass, what happens, and my impression is there's not a lot different in terms of what happens.
Well, my intent is, and generally what happens is if we have a conversation around these things, we'll have a public hearing, then I will make a recommendation coming back to the council for your action. And so I would plan on still doing that. If the council direction today is, this is what your recommendation will be,
Ready for
then that's what my recommendation would be.
So would that mean that we wouldn't have a public hearing, or that we would have a public hearing about a specific motion as opposed to a general public hearing? Would the public hearing purpose and content change?
You still have the public hearing. I would believe that you would still be required to have a public hearing if there's a change in an ordinance, but they would be having a public hearing about a specific ordinance at that time, because they would know what that recommended
these
ordinance
changes.
is.
And the public hearing you were planning to have before the motion would have had what purpose?
The purpose would be is for people to have input into the ordinance. It is sunsetting, so they could talk about whether or not they believe it should be sunsetted, and any other changes they would like to see to the ordinance. I would consider that to make my final recommendation.
So the public hearing would guide you in terms of coming back to us with a recommendation with regard to what to do with it, as opposed to having something told to you come back to us with this.
Generally, I don't make a final recommendation until after a public
After a
hearing
public
if there's
hearing.
an intent to have a public hearing prior to an item.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm trying to decide what's the functional difference, and what I'm hearing is the way you had originally planned it was something would still come back to us.
Correct.
But you wanted to have a hearing, process what that is, and then come back with your recommendation for what to do next, as opposed to, let's just go and do this and have a hearing on that. I think we'll get to the same place, but I'm inclined to want to hear your recommendation based on a public hearing. So I don't think I'll support the motion, not that I don't support the intent, but I want to give you the opportunity to process this in the thoughtful, deliberate way. So I think that I won't support it for that reason, but it's not that I don't want us to get something and I don't want us to get to someplace. With regard to the other two topic areas that have come up, one with regard to making it permanent or not, it's related to Andrea's point about, does the exclusion zone cause crime in other areas? Are they related somehow? Which adds this to the list of whack-a-mole issues. Or is there some other dynamic at work here? Would crime be moving out to the areas because of the 9 officers, or would crime move out to other areas because of the exclusion zone? And how do we address this as part of a larger conversation, which means as a tool in the toolbox, there's lots of other tools, and I want to understand how these tools are interrelated and how they work together. The exclusion zone on its own is part, I can't just look at it on its own. It is part of a larger conversation about the interrelationship of things. And so whether it needs to be permanent or whether it needs to sunset at some point, I don't know yet. And so I wouldn't be prepared today to say whether I want it to be permanent or not. I would want to hear public hearing. I want to hear more about how it interacts with the other elements. So I'm still in that thoughtful stage. And so at this point, I'm not ready to do anything too quickly. I still want to kind of proceed with kind of what I think your original game plan was, which I think will still get us to where we want to be.
Reminding you, we're 5 minutes into our next time slot, and I've got 4 people: George Brown, Chris. Oh, I got Chris. Sorry,
I'm out.
You're out now. Betty. So it's George Brown, Betty, and Mike.
I'll go fast. I have a question for the prosecutor. This is an excerpt from the letter that the ACLU wrote. I'd just like to get your comment on that. Basically, they're arguing that we can just use the current judicial system and accomplish pretty much the same thing. This is a quote, "If a person is suspected of one of the crimes included in the exclusion ordinance, they can be arrested or cited and then must appear before a judge. At that time, if the person is going to remain in or be released from custody before going to trial, the district attorney can request the judge to issue an exclusion order as part of the release conditions. And if the person pleads guilty or goes to trial and is found guilty, then at the time of sentencing, the judge can order the person excluded as part of the sentence." Kind of like a restraining order, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd like to comment on that.
Yes,
because
please.
The list of offenses that are on the 90-day exclusion list, which are the pre-conviction exclusions, I've got that list, and I would guess that 80% of those offenses are felonies, mostly drug offenses. We added some sexual crimes that are felonies as part of the 90-day exclusion list. With the jail bed situation for felony offenses, county offenses, they aren't holding people who are alleged to have committed very serious crimes or their sentences are matrixed out. I don't have any confidence at all that a pretrial order by a circuit court judge on somebody who's charged with possession of heroin to stay out of the downtown mall is going to have any effect at all at keeping that person out of the mall or the downtown safety zone. So with that jail bed situation, if they violate that restriction and the officer arrests them, they're not going to be held really at all. There just is no sanction, especially for pretrial offenses that are on the 90-day list. As I say, most of them are felony offenses. If they are excluded after a hearing in municipal court and they then go back into the downtown safety zone, we don't care whether that's a violation of the circuit court order to stay out. They've committed the new offense of unlawful entry into the downtown safety zone. So it gives the officers a very strong tool to keep those 90-day offenses out of the zone, even though there may be some corresponding circuit court restriction, which has very little teeth, and it seems to be getting less and less all the time with the county's problems, as Councilor Poling mentioned.
Okay, I'm just having a hard time understanding why that would carry weight, but a judge's exclusion order wouldn't. So
It could be ordered from the circuit court to stay out of there, but on a pretrial restriction, there's just virtually very little sanction that could be imposed.
I see, pretrial. You're talking about pretrial now.
Pretrial
Okay.
offenses,
All right.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I have a number of things responding to what other people have said. But first, if you don't want them to move to another location, I don't see what we can do except give them a one-way bus ticket to somewhere far away. We don't believe in killing people. Other thing, I would like to hear, if it were possible to bring those people in, I would like a hearing with the people who've been excluded. I would like to hear what they have to say about it, rather than what someone else has to say. Mike has attributed the better situation with Betty Snowden and Mr. Camus to the exclusion zone. It may be attributable to more police presence rather than that. We don't know. And I still think we should try a time without it and see what happens. As far as the chance, as they're having another chance to be dismissed, I'd like to point out two things from two letters. A letter from Kayla Schott-Bressler, which says it unfairly discriminates those unable to understand the complexities of the exclusion process. Those people are not going to show up in court. They're not going to look for an advocate. And in Claire Surratt's letter, I mentioned this before, but individuals lacking knowledge or confidence in the system, they don't come in and complain. So they don't get another chance. As far as the jail beds are concerned, I think I read that if they violate the exclusion order, then you send them to jail. Well, how are you going to do that if there are no jail beds? There still aren't any more jail beds. So, if that's the problem, I don't see how that would help. And that's it. Thanks. Mike.
First, I'll withdraw the motion based on the count at the table, okay? To respond to a couple of things quickly. One, the alcohol impact area. Actually, Sergeant Fitzpatrick and I went up with our lobbyist to Salem and lobbied for that bill during the last session. And we're not successful. There were some folks in Portland who had some concerns that they could never quite work out the details of. But within the OLCC, there's some regulatory opportunity for us to have greater leeway to enhance some of those solutions in downtown Eugene, and we're looking forward to that. There may be some legislative fixes necessary in this next session, but a lot of it looked to be able to be done administratively. I would also say we need to make sure that for the sake of the public watching this, that we're very, very clear. The downtown public safety zone was never proposed and never put in place to mitigate the fact that we didn't have enough police officers. It was put in place to fix the fact that we don't have enough jail beds. We today have 84 fewer jail beds than we had on the day we put this in place. The problem isn't going away. It's now gotten worse. We don't need this less. We need it more now. And I appreciate the mayor's point of view with regard to an ongoing review of this, and I could understand that. I think that's wise. I would suggest, however, rather than 1 year, that you consider 2. It may take the county a couple of years to come up with some new solutions, and perhaps they will with regard to the jail beds. But I'd ask you to consider 2 years in the sunset. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap it up now. We're into almost 15 minutes of the time for the next issue. I want to thank you all very much for the time with us today, and we'll be back again. All right. Thank you. Thank you. So the next item up is the Envision Eugene Low-Density Residential Redesignation. We're going to do this little transition thing here.
Yeah.
Both in our heads and in terms of topic.
Short on time, so.
That's a complicated subject.
Feel free to start any
By
time.
the way, I'm okay with withdrawing the motion.
Just in case anybody's wondering
We
about the
figured you
second.
were. We figured you were.
I'll
Good
agree.
afternoon, Mayor and Council. Good afternoon. We're just going to jump right on in here. We're back
Please.
to you to talk about Envision Eugene. Today we are talking about our single-family land need as that relates to low-density residential land. So we'll give you a brief update. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the potential to redesignate some properties that are inside our our current urban growth boundary that may help us address some of this need that we have for more land for single-family homes. So I'm going to turn it right over to Heather.
Good afternoon. So as Carolyn mentioned, we're going to do an update of our low-density residential land need and then talk about redesignation options to low-density residential. This is part of Envision Eugene, so we always put the pillars up here. And as a reminder, these are a framework that guide the analysis that we're doing. One of the applicable pillars here that we'll talk a little bit about is compact development and efficient transportation. So as we've talked to you about our single-family housing need, we've used this graphic, and what we're going to update you on are the components that are highlighted in red up there. So the first component is that as we've been talking to you about what our single-family housing land need is, we've been really focusing on our single-family, how much land we need for a single-family housing as a housing type. We're going to transition here and start talking about what our land need is for low-density residential. The key difference here is that some multifamily housing happens on low-density residential, and so you can see that the demand under, as an example, of 55-45 mix, a demand in general goes up when we start talking about low-density residential. We also told you that we were going to come back to you with a revised capacity estimate for our vacant land, and that was due to the work that was completed by the partially vacant subgroup of the technical resource group. They completed the analysis on partially vacant land and wanted to make sure that we use the same capacity methodology on our vacant land analysis. And so we've gone back, applied the partially vacant methodology, updated our vacant land capacity numbers, and those went down a little bit. For partially vacant, that number is updated to reflect, as you may recall, we have previously been holding out as a separate category the capacity on partially vacant land that was transportation and wastewater constrained. That in part was due to really highlight that we've got some areas in the city that have potential capacity, but we need to update our public facilities plans and our transportation system plan to make sure that they support the capacity that we're assuming in these areas. And so we've been working with our public works staff on the updates needed to make sure that those areas are served. So we've included that capacity back in the partially vacant capacity analysis, or result, I should say. What that means is the overall effect of those adjustments are that the demand and the capacity both went up, but the demand went up more than the capacity inside the urban growth boundary. However, as you'll see in the red box or orange box on the right, it didn't go, the difference isn't that much more. So the deficit went up about 156 additional units that we have more of a deficit for. So it's 926 low-density residential units that we have a deficit for. We can translate that into acres, and that was under a 55-45 mix. So when you look at this graph, and you go to the 55-45 mix column, that 926 units equates to 244 acres needed for housing. So the top row in this graphic makes that translation of how many acres are needed for housing by the different housing mixes that we've discussed. And then to get an idea of what our total low-density residential land need is, we have to add in the acres that are needed for things like neighborhood commercial, parks, public facilities, and then group quarters, which are like dorms and nursing homes. When we add all those things together, you can see the bottom row shows you what our deficiency is for our low-density residential land need. So now that we have a better idea of what our numbers are for our low-density residential land need, we can start looking at the outstanding issue, which is how much land should we redesignate for low-density residential inside the urban growth boundary. We've also been working on our multifamily housing numbers, and what we know is that we actually are projected to have a surplus of medium-density residential land for the next 20 years. And so that creates an opportunity to look at those lands and see if there's areas to redesignate to low-density residential. So we've showed you this map before. This is a map of, this is actually our Metro Plan land use diagram for the Eugene portion. And the two areas that we have focused in on for opportunities for redesignation to low-density residential are in North Eugene and West Eugene. They are the properties that are shown up there in kind of a orangey red brown color that is circled in, thank you, let's see if I can get this, there we go, circled in red here and here. These properties that are that color are planned on the Metro Plan as medium density residential, so they're those are part of that surplus that we have. They're also on the edge of town. You can see here, oh, I keep hitting the water bottle. Here is the urban growth boundary and the urban growth boundary up here. They're actually not near existing commercial centers or major transit facilities. As you know, as part of our compact urban development and efficient transportation pillar, we are trying to plan for multifamily housing to be along our core transit corridors and closer to existing commercial and transit services. Additionally, these areas are mostly undeveloped or underdeveloped and have infrastructure or other constraints that actually might otherwise limit the amount of density we could get out in these areas anyway. So the first area I'm going to focus on is in North Eugene. Those areas again are circled in red here. We've got Delta Highway, Ayers Road, and Gillum.
Where are the nines and
Sorry?
the nines golf course?
The red dotted line.
Yep.
Is that it?
Yeah, this is actually all golf course here.
That's it.
Just wanted to make sure.
Yes, and so we are working, in this case, there are two property owners that are part of this study area. And again, in red here, and you can see the golf course here. It's about 54 acres within that red area. Again, on the edges of town, you can see the urban growth boundary is almost abutting the property right across the street. There is some existing medium density residential here, and then this area is also planned for medium density residential. What we've heard from these folks is that they are interested in redesignation to low-density residential. So we have heard that. We've also heard that there's concern in this area for, thank you, concern in this area for traffic concerns and transportation limitations that might happen out here. So redesignation, and you may have all heard that, redesignation of the areas, the 54 acres, is what we're recommending at this time. It would help with some of the traffic concerns. Again, there is some medium density residential that can occur and has occurred out here, so we've got a mixture of housing types here. And so at this point, that's what we're recommending in this area. So I'm going to move now to West Eugene. Pointer back out. We've got Green Hill, West 11th, and urban growth boundaries here. This area is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that than in North Eugene. It's about 260 acres and about 50 properties. So you can see right there, it's pretty different from the North Eugene study area. Again, it's also on the edge of town. We've got the orange line shown here as the urban growth boundary. It borders both sides of the study area. West 11th, which is a gateway into the city, borders this property. Most of it is outside of the city limits. What you're seeing in gray, gray shading here is what's in the city limits. And again, to point this out, the study boundary is in red. So this is the only area that's in the city limits. And probably partially as a result of that, there is minimal development out in this area. It's mostly underdeveloped, not a lot of road infrastructure, and there's quite a few large lots that, again, are underdeveloped or not developed at all. What we've heard from people about this area is that they really like the rural character of the area. And I think if you ask some people, it doesn't even feel like it's in the urban growth boundary. It is really on kind of the edge of town. We've also heard people question the suitability of this area for multifamily housing, not only because of the location and the distance from the core of the city, but also just the amount, since it's 260 acres. We know there are transportation issues out here. We've heard a lot about that, and I'll get into that in a little more depth. And then as far as interest in developing in the future, different from North Eugene, where we're working with 2 property owners, in this area, you've got about 50 properties. It's quite varied in whether or not people are interested in developing right now or much further into the future or not at all. The other some other considerations we want to think about in this area about how it will develop in the future are what the existing conditions are. So this first slide, I'm pointing out here in brown, are known protected wetlands and streams. This area is part of the West Eugene Wetlands Plan, and so those are the areas that are known to be known as protected when this area develops. There's probably more wetlands out here, and those may have more flexibility in development, but these are the ones that are protected. In the blue, those are contour lines, so you can see we've got hillsides here, and then in the aerial photo you can see we've got oak woodlands up here as well. The blue lines that you're seeing are eWeb water lines, so you can see that water lines are actually pretty close to this area, right across the street on West 11th in Edcone, and then also in West 11th near Terry. eWeb confirms that there is capacity to serve this area. And the purple lines, which are in much the same location, also shows that this area is served by wastewater, can be served, and there is capacity to serve this area. And then finally, transportation. The red along West 11th is showing this is a major arterial. What we know about this is that actually this section of West 11th is under ODOT's jurisdiction, so most major development that would occur in this area has to be coordinated with ODOT. We know that there have been conversations about access limitations due to ODOT restrictions. We also know that their development potential has been limited in this area due to some of those restrictions, and so that's something we're very aware of and need to work on. Another consideration is how the area is planned on the Metro Plan and how it's zoned. So again, the area is currently planned for medium density residential, but the current zoning for this whole study area is R1 low density residential. What that means is that any major development that would want to happen in this area would need to go through a zone change, and that zone change would need to be consistent with the existing Metro Plan designation. That means it would need to go to R2. As a result of some of the transportation regulations that we work with, we know that it has been difficult for rezoning out in this area. And again, as I mentioned earlier, development has been limited as a result of that. So we believe that redesignation to low density residential, however much that is, that some of that would alleviate some of that roadblock. So as we mentioned to you a couple meetings ago, we sent letters out to property owners in this area. This gives you an initial idea of the interest people have in developing with single-family housing. This is a result of not only conversations we had after the letters went out, but also of a meeting that we had on January 12th with property owners out there. What we heard on those phone calls and also at that meeting was that many property owners might be interested in low-density residential, but they wanted a lot more information. They wanted a little bit more in-depth planning, such as where is the road infrastructure going to go? Where are parks going to go? How much would really be redesignated to low density and how much might stay as medium density residential? And the other big component was making sure that if an area is redesignated to low density residential, that we get concurrence from ODOT, that those state transportation rules I was talking about is not going to be an issue for those folks once they redesignate. So that's something that needs to be worked on.
I'm having a hard time distinguishing between the colors.
Sure.
Which ones are the ones that said no?
Yep, so what you have here is kind of an orange or a darker color. So it's this property, these two, and these two, which are two property owners. The green is an initial, yeah, we're interested. The yellows are a maybe, and then the folks that don't have a check mark are folks we haven't heard from. So thanks for that. So when we went to the meeting with the property owners in this area, we talked about 3 general concepts for how development might happen here in the future. The first is to remain as multifamily. So it stays medium density residential. There's no redesignation. The second is to do kind of the opposite, which is to redesignate the whole area to low density residential. The third option is to do some more in-depth planning and come up with an appropriate mix of low density and medium density residential. To give you an idea of how many homes you might be able to fit in this area depending on how much is redesignated, we've got this graphic up here. So the first row shows if nothing is redesignated, there's capacity for about 2,500 medium density residential units. The bottom row shows you if it's all redesignated to low density residential, there's capacity for about 732 low density residential units. And then I want to point out the middle bar here. It says near zero MDR surplus. As I mentioned earlier, we're projected to have a surplus of medium density residential land for the next 20 years. If we redesignated enough of the area to bring that surplus down to zero, then that would be about half and half of the area. But I think the question still remains is, does it make sense to have 125 acres in this area be designated for medium density residential and 125 for low density? So what the appropriate mix is, I think is still to be determined if we go that route. And that is the route that we're recommending. We're recommending to do more in-depth analysis, and what that would involve is for the Envision Eugene recommendation this spring that we would define a target number of units to redesignate in this area. And then prior to adoption of the Envision Eugene package, we would develop a concept plan for the area that addresses transportation, parks, natural resources, and an appropriate LDR and MDR development pattern. And then we would refine our LDR and MDR land need for the whole city based on that concept plan. So however much we redesignate to low density residential, we take off that of the need for expansion. And then the fourth step is that we, as part of the Envision Eugene adoption package, we would include any areas for redesignation to low density residential in that package. I want to also mention that on Monday, we went to the Planning Commission just this last Monday. They expressed general support for our recommendation for North Eugene, as well as pursuing option C here for West Eugene.
And finally, I'll just bring you up to speed on where we are with our broader timeline. Currently, we are looking at coming back to you in March with our initial recommendation. We continue to work really hard with our technical resource group. We're meeting about once or twice a week with them right now, and we're thoughtfully considering all these numbers that we're bringing to you. And so our current timeline is to bring that back to you before your break in March. We'll then enter into a series of community forums that we'll hold kind of throughout the city to get input on that recommendation. We'll have a public hearing in April, and then back to you for your consideration in May. Then after that, remember, there is a formal adoption process that we go through, but this is kind of laying out the next couple of months. That's it.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes to ask questions or make observations or whatever. Pat?
Thank you. I do have 3 questions, probably pretty quick. You have a recommendation for the West Eugene, a plan for the West Eugene area, but you didn't lay one in the chart for North Eugene.
For the North Eugene, we were recommending the 54 acres that were shown in red as being redesignated to low-density residential.
Okay, so the West Eugene has a couple more steps to go. Okay. Second is just regarding the technical resource group. Has the membership of that group changed over the last couple of months, or is it remaining fairly static?
No, it's the same membership.
And then the third question is you mentioned development restrictions based on transportation. That's development restrictions that come from the state, needless to say, and that changing the designation would alleviate some of that roadblock. Now, the development restrictions based on transportation, can you explain that a little bit more?
I will. So the state has what's called a transportation planning rule, and anytime you are rezoning or redesignating a property, you have to look at the transportation facilities in the area and determine whether you're having what's called a significant effect, an additional effect on that transportation facility that would cause
roads,
it to
right?
fail.
That
Sorry,
means
thank
roads,
you. Roads. On those roads that would cause it to fail. And what our opinion is that if the area is already planned for medium density housing, and so that has a higher number of vehicles that would occur. If you're redesignating it to low density residential, that has a lower number of vehicles that would occur, so you're not going to be significantly impacting the road.
Thank you. I think I understand that part. Now, why would we ever plan for that kind of density if we didn't have the transportation facilities in place?
I think originally that area was planned for medium density residential housing because we thought there would be more employment in that area than there has ended up being, and so it would have been able to serve the employment area across in kind of the West 11th industrial area.
Now, wouldn't the same transportation restrictions apply to improving the employment situation there also, adding employment facilities?
Actually, the application of the transportation planning rule to zone changes is a newer occurrence, so I'm not sure that that was in effect at the time that they planned for that area.
Okay, so it seems that if we had more employment in there, the transportation facility issue would still be an issue, whether it were residential or more employment in the area.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the transportation facilities were that were planned at that time, but I know the issues that we're having now, and our opinion is that this would alleviate that issue.
You know, I have a certain bias, you may... But I'm assuming then that because the West Eugene Parkway was originally part of the transportation plan, then some of this development was based upon upon the fact that was that was addressing some of the transportation
See the magic
that
word
area,
or not or not?
and the West Eugene Parkway isn't there. is, as a part of, is it a part of the reason that we have development restrictions based upon transportation facilities?
No.
I take that as a rhetorical question. I mean, I think
The answer is no, Matt.
I don't think the answer is no. Okay, rhetorical question. So my assumption is correct then. Okay, thank you. That's all.
I would just add to that conversation because we're in the midst of some changes in policy around this issue at the state level right now, where they're building in a lot more flexibility so that we can meet our greenhouse gas goals and other kinds of environmental social equity goals. And so the state is in the process of changing all of that policy to make it more flexible, to make it enable communities to do what they want with their planning more easily. George Brown.
Thank you. I'm looking at the map for North Eugene, the two parcels there. Are those two parcels together? Is that the 54-acre figure? That's a total for both of them?
Yes.
Okay. And how many dwelling units of low density would fit there?
79.
79. Okay. On both of them. Okay. How many medium-density residential would fit on both of those?
I believe it's 211, but I can...
211.
Let me look.
Could you just briefly, I think maybe for the people that are watching, but also for me too a little bit, is what typically, we're not talking about apartment, that would be high-density residential. What typically would be considered medium-density residential development?
Right. Well, with medium-density residential, there is a lower height limit than there is for high-density residential. So, and it's closer to actually the R1 single-family height restriction. So right there, the height of the buildings that you would see would be somewhere between 2 to 3 story. But you can see a variety of housing types in that area. I mean, it could be one building that's 2 to 3 stories. It could be, garden apartments. Could be attached housing, and occasionally we see subdivisions on small lots.
Generally on smaller lots too. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Okay, thank you. And then I just was wondering if we jump back to the West Eugene area, you said that you showed that there was a kind of a fairly small portion of wetlands intruding in that one northwest edge. What about Class 1 and 2 soils? Are there any farms out there? It's kind of hard to tell from the aerial photo.
Right. We haven't actually looked at the soils. This area is inside the urban growth boundary, and so I think some people probably are. I know we've got a Christmas farm out there, so they're using it for that purpose. So some of that activity is going on.
Okay. Thank you.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. According to ODOT, the Delta and Beltline, the Beltline from Coburg to River Road is a failed facility. It's a massively failed facility when you measure vehicle compactness and volume of traffic, and the percentages that they use for their standard are we're off the scale in the measurement. We're over 100% failure rate, and specifically at Delta Beltline. It's huge, which is why the ODOT's looking at fixing that facility, or at least looking at something new there. So I'm certainly in favor of the idea that what we would do with that zone, with that area, would have less of an impact than what is currently the case. That's great. I think it's still, however, especially at Delta Beltline, at such a state that you're never going to build anything, really, when you have the need to do the TIA out there, right? I mean, when you actually get time to push dirt around, can it actually be built with the current facility?
You're right. They will have to go through a TIA analysis, any development that triggers 100 trips or more, and there's some other requirements that require you to go through a TIA analysis. But we're going through a transportation system plan update right now, where we're looking at making sure that the capacity we're assuming is consistent.
And that's where I was hoping we'd get, as the mayor mentioned, new standards. So we've talked about with some of these fixes that maybe what we can do is actually help people have at least some degree of confidence that if we're going to make these changes and we're going to do Envision Eugene properly, that they'll actually be able to build the things we plan, or that we'll put some sort of waiver on TIA need. Is that coming into play with this particular piece as well?
Well, that will be looked at more through the Transportation System Plan update, and I don't know what the different options that they're looking at, whether a waiver of a TIA is on the table, but certainly we need to look at where are the constrained areas and what projects can be identified to alleviate those problems.
It sounds wonderful to me for us to look at how do we accommodate and grow more intelligently. That sounds fantastic. But I'm of the opinion, too, that our transportation facilities, our roads, with regard to capacity, are massively substandard, and the standards will have to change dramatically before we're actually ever going to be able to build some of the stuff we want if we're not looking at newer solutions in the planning process. So I'll be real excited to see what happens through the work that we're doing with this.
And I think what our intent is not to have phantom capacity.
That's what I'm
as
looking for
part
too,
of the
Mr. Manager.
recommendation. So
Thank you.
that's what our intent is.
Okay.
So.
With that, thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry we crunched you, but you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. I love the graphic. I understand it because I understand it.
That's why we keep using it.
Yeah, right.
No, it'd still be.